Welcome to the Peace Alliance Winnipeg webinar, and thank you for joining us in this important discussion. My name is Glenn Michalchuk, and I'm chair of the Peace Alliance Winnipeg. Our topic of this webinar is the new Cold War, Canadian foreign policy, and Canada's peace movement. Frequently, we are hearing the term new Cold War to describe the situation in the world. What is meant by this term, new Cold War? Does it represent a threat to Canadians? And what are its implications for Canada? And how does official Canadian government foreign policy contribute to global instability and the threat of a hot war? And finally, what must Canada's peace movement do in response to all of this? So these are the range of topics we'd like to discuss under that theme. And to discuss these topics today, we are joined by three people who've actually contributed much to this discussion in Canada. Radhika Desai is a professor at the Department of Political Studies and director of the Geopolitical Economy Research Group, University of Manitoba. She is the author of Geopolitical Economy After US Hegemony, Globalization and Empire, and numerous other books and articles on political and geopolitical economy and world affairs. And Yves Engler is a Montreal-based activist and author who has published 11 books on various aspects of Canadian foreign policy. His latest book is titled House of Mirror, Justin Trudeau's Foreign Policy. Our other speaker is Tamara Lorincz. She is a PhD candidate in global governance at the Balsillie School for International Affairs at Wilfrid Laurier University. She is on the board of directors of the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space, and on the International Advisory Committee of the No to NATO Network. She is a member of the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace and the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. So the format for today's meeting is that we will have our three speakers speak first for approximately 15 minutes, followed by a question and answer period. The order of speakers will be Radhika Desai, Yves Engler, and then Tamara. In terms of fielding questions or your contributions to the discussion, what we would ask you to do is to, in the reaction part of your Zoom screen, raise your hand, and Paul Graham, who's the moderator, who's assisting me in moderating, will be taking down your names and then calling on you when it's time for a question or comment. So without anything further from me, I'd like to ask Radhika to begin speaking. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Glenn, and thanks for Peace Alliance Winnipeg for asking me to do this. I'm really happy, and I'm really happy to do this on the same platform as Yves and Tamara, who I think have contributed an enormous amount to the peace movement in Canada. What I want to do today is to give a historical perspective on the new Cold War, place it in the longer history of the world that has been shaped on the one hand by capitalist imperialism and on the other hand by resistance to it, a process that I sometimes in a sort of theoretical way call the dialectic of uneven and combined development. What I have to say will be divided into four parts. I want to first say something about what was the original Cold War. Then I want to reflect briefly on what is new about the new Cold War. Thirdly, I want to say a few things about the difference that Biden makes. And finally, why we should very urgently and strenuously resist this new Cold War, because it is in many ways even more dangerous than the previous one. What was that previous Cold War? Both its beginnings and its end are shrouded in myths, and therefore it's important to visit it briefly. During the Cold War, many people used the Cold War to justify American aggression, that it was understandable because there was this Cold War and the United States needed to be militarily and in other ways pretty aggressive. In reality, it was American aggression which arose from a peculiar and historically anachronistic form of American imperialism that was itself the cause of the original Cold War. Because in the United States, on top of the usual reasons for being imperialistic, which basically all developed capitalist countries have, the United States added another layer, and that layer was that from the early 20th century, it had its leaders, its policymakers, its businessmen, business classes wanted the United States to essentially develop the same sort of dominance over the world as the United Kingdom or Britain had in the 19th century and right up until the First World War. So these ambitions therefore opened a new, so these ambitions essentially, in the trying to realize these ambitions, the United States has never succeeded, but nevertheless its attempts have marked the evolution of the world order very deeply. Therefore, the Cold War itself has to be seen as a chapter in the history of imperialism. The American attempt to try to emulate British-style dominance was hugely historically ironic. On the one hand, the world had already become, by the time the United States began nursing these ambitions, the world had already become multipolar in the sense that British supremacy had already been challenged by the industrialization of other powers, whether it's the United States itself or Germany or Japan and elsewhere. And their competition had already led to the First World War and then eventually to the Second World War in a single 30 years crisis of 1914 to 1945. And many have argued, and I have argued as well in my own writings, that you could kind of see this as almost the end of the road, really, for capitalism. But and in a very important sense, it is American imperialism that has lengthened the life of capitalism. Otherwise, we would be on a very different path, and we can discuss this further. Because by this time, capitalism had already become hugely monopolistic. Essentially regulated in a very different way, in a national way, and so on. And in the view of Marx and many later observers, it was ripe for a transition to socialism. The United States, however, in trying to achieve a diluted version of British-style dominance, extended the life of capitalism. Of course, its attempt to try to create the dominance failed both militarily and financially, but its efforts marked the history of the 20th century. So the original Cold War, which Gabriel and Joyce Kolko called the Cold Peace between the United States and the Soviet Union, was in fact very hot in the Third World. That's where the United States was essentially trying to make newly independent Third World countries, bring them into its own ambit and so on. And during this Cold War, revolutions against imperialism, which was basically revolutions rejecting the terms on which the United States and the West offered integration to the Third World, when they rejected it, such revolutions were blamed on the US and South. And that's how you got this communist scare and so on. They were actually simply reactions to the terms on which the West wished to continue the relationship with Third World countries, essentially as neo-colonialism, as Julius Nyerere called it. So that is the beginning of the Cold War. And in some of the writings I've been doing, I've also showed that historical writings show that the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki as early as 1945 were directly connected to this Cold War. Okay, so the origins of the Cold War are shrouded in mystery. So is its end. The end of the Cold War, the disintegration of the Soviet Union, was an internal event. It was not that the Soviet economy was collapsing. Yes, there were problems, but there were also strategies to deal with them. It is not like there was a groundswell of opposition to the Soviet system. On the contrary, the Soviet public expected the reform, not the ruin of the Soviet system. And nor was it true that military pressure by the West made the Soviet Union collapse. None of these things are true. What actually happened was essentially the reform process was hijacked by a small number of members of the elite who had essentially lost any commitment to socialism, and they enacted what one analyst called a revolution from above. So the end of the Cold War did not prove the superiority of the Western system, and nor did it prove the superiority of American capitalism. On the contrary, the end of the Cold War occurred at a time when American capitalism was so debilitated that, as some of you may remember if you are old enough, that the 1992 election was an election in which one of the most successful third-party candidacies occurred when Ross Perot ran on a platform of having industrial policy, standing up to the Japanese challenge and all that, because it was debilitating American capitalism. So essentially, and finally, the re-emergence of American aggression, even more unrestrained because there was no Soviet Union to stop it, in the post-Cold War period also demonstrates that the Cold War itself was not a justification of American aggression, but on the contrary, American imperial designs caused the Cold War and has continued to cause the problem since. The world has not enjoyed a peace dividend since then. On the contrary, we have seen unending wars coming from the United States. Of course, these wars are also failing as much as before, if not more so, in achieving the American objectives. And that is why the other expectation of the end of the Cold War, which was that we would see a unipolar movement, has also not been realized. Okay, so that was the old. What is new about the new? Much of it remains the same dreary old story. There are red scares about the dangers to capitalism disguised as dangers to freedom. There is a military buildup which benefits an even bigger military industrial complex than ever before, including a new nuclear arms race. There is McCarthyite style repression is already beginning in the United States and other countries that are allied with it. Of course, there is alliance building abroad, although as I will come to in a minute, this is occurring in very different and much less circumstances. There is the increased activity of an unaccountable secret state, which is acting both domestically and internationally. And finally, and perhaps this is something that we are beginning to experience in a very acute way, the fact that truth is the first casualty of war is being realized once again, because public discourse has been deeply damaged by this new Cold War. But there are also a number of important differences. First of all, there is a different origin as well. The old Cold War basically the old Cold War began more or less as soon as the Bolshevik Revolution started. And of course, when the Chinese Revolution occurred, China was the target of that old Cold War as well, and often facing greater dangers than the USSR because China was much less. We can talk about that again. But once China's reform period began, the Americans thought, just like the Soviet Union, China could be made to bring socialism to an end. And that has essentially not happened. The Americans tried to embrace China, make it enter the WTO, and thought that China would simply turn into another neoliberal capitalism. This has not happened. That's one difference. And China, by the way, Chinese elites are very, very aware of the Chinese party state, and its leadership is very, very aware of the fate of the Soviet Union and how they must avoid that. Secondly, the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union was a Cold War between two relatively stable and prosperous societies. This is not so today. Today, the United States is in accelerated decline. Its decline is so marked that it is vitiating its political system, its culture, and its economy, its economic decline, etc. And China, by contrast, is rising, it is stable, and it is functioning much better, as you see also in the context of the pandemic. So over the last 30-odd years, the United States has come to rely even more than ever before on military and financial means of trying to essentially expand its influence because its economic power has been declining. Moreover, the economy has become a new arena of trade wars. Trade and technology wars are a symptom. Mind you, of course, there was a certain type of technological competition back with USSR as well, which early on, at least, the USSR appeared to fit with Sputnik. Okay. Thirdly, the US and USSR economic connections were virtually nil to most of the war. Whereas today, the situation is much more dangerous because after decades of trying to change China, has also made the American capitalism very reliant on China. The United States is actually in many ways fighting a losing war, fighting a war in which it often has to cut its nose, fight its face, and so on. Ultimately, what's at the bottom of it is that the United States is unable to tolerate not just multipolarity, but what Hugo Chavez called pluripolarity. That is to say, the existence of many different types of socioeconomic systems within the world system, for the simple reason that the United States want all countries in the world to become equally neoliberal. That's not going to happen because it is simply not possible for many countries to remain viable entities while adopting neoliberalism. But this relentless enterprise is making the world more volatile, more unstable. Okay, thirdly, what difference will Biden make? Not much. Biden is captive of the same political and geopolitical economy that Trump was. He serves the same corporate and financialized elite, and he has won by taking back the votes of the very blue wall that Trump had triumphed previous in the 2016 election. So he needs to have pretty well so much the same line. The chief difference is that there will be a greater reliance on allies, on NATO, and so on. And this is where Canada comes in. There will be a greater pressure on allies to step in line, to spend more money on the military. And this is happening at a time when Canadians should note that the willingness of the Europeans and the Japanese to go along with such pressure is dwindling quite rapidly. They are also aware that many of these actions are bound to make the world a more dangerous place for them. Because, of course, in North America, we are splendidly isolated from the vast Eurasian landmass where much of the history generally takes place. So in this, and so in Canada, we are already seeing its effects. There is continuing intransigence on the arrest of Meng Wanzhou. There is the influence in the wider political system, as we have seen in the recent parliamentary vote on matters on the ongoing, essentially alleging that there is genocide occurring in Xinjiang without any evidence for it whatsoever. There is people are rattling the sabers on Hong Kong, etc. There is now also the Beijing Olympics business that is being discussed. So we are beginning to see a huge influence in Canada. Canadians are also participating militarily in exercises of military intimidation against China, even though that military intimidation has absolutely nothing to do with with Canada's military needs. And of course, finally, our public discourse is being vitiated by more and more smoke and mirrors on democracy and human rights. So I know I have to end in 2 minutes, and I will. So why should we resist new Cold War? Because it makes the world a far more dangerous place. The aggression is coming essentially from the United States, and Canada and our elites and all our political parties seem to have no resistance to it. So we are going to be going on an extremely bumpy roller coaster ride, an extremely dangerous roller coaster ride. Our culture and our public discourse are being vitiated. Canadians are being prevented from benefiting from a healthy relationship with one of the world's oldest and most vibrant cultures, most inventive cultures. And having to resign themselves to down-market versions of the Falun Gong type versions of that culture. This is a huge sacrifice of our right to know things, to experience cultures, and so on. We are already seeing dissent being suppressed, and this will go on. There will continue to be hot wars in third world countries. This is another reason why we should resist it. Further, and very seriously, this new Cold War is aimed at preventing the emergence of more equal, more sustainable, and more prosperous societies. Because essentially it's about preventing countries from turning away from neoliberalism, but neoliberalism is what has brought us to this very, very sorry task. So the need of the hour is to press home the need for everybody concerned to accept what Chavez called a pluripolar world. That is the only way in which different types of systems can coexist peacefully. If we are not able to do that, we are also trapping ourselves in a capitalist system that has long stopped working for us. We will not learn the many things that have allowed China, for example, to lift millions out of poverty, to undertake the greatest industrial revolution in the world, and today to take the lead in technology, including in green technology. And above all, and this is my final point, by diluting words like genocide, we will be preventing the all-important struggles of indigenous people in North America and the world over, who are still suffering ongoing genocide. We will be unable to support their struggles for their rights, for their land, for their sovereignty. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Radhika. I will now ask Yves Engler to present.
Thanks, Glenn. Thanks, everyone, for being here. I'm going to just speak on Canada's role. According to the head of the opposition Conservatives, Aaron O'Toole, he's explicitly calling for a new Cold War with China. And he's also been on record saying there's no greater threat to Canada's interests than the rise of China. I think I would suggest that the climate crisis is a greater threat. I would suggest the pandemic is a greater threat. I would suggest inequality is a greater threat. The opioid crisis, and on and on and on. So there is a pretty intense saber rattling in the Canadian officialdom on China, and it goes across the political spectrum. I was kind of thinking about recently, as much as I dislike the Trudeau Liberals, history might judge that people should be voting for Trudeau, progressive people should be voting for Trudeau over the Greens and the NDP, who are both aggressively pushing this new Cold War with China, and in fact the Liberals are resisting it. I throw that out there more as a something to generate thought rather than a serious idea, but I think, you know, we unfortunately in a decade or 2 decades from now we might actually view it that way, and it's a little bit befuddling to me, because the reality is that most of corporate Canada doesn't want this, right? They want make money off of the huge Chinese market. There's a lot of profits to be made, and you know, important sectors of the Liberal Party, like people like Jean Chrétien, all kinds of former foreign ministers who are not really like keen on this. And this is something that the Trudeau government is resisting to a fairly significant extent. I think the Trudeau cabinet's probably divided on it. There's people like Chrystia Freeland, I think, is more on board with the anti-China kind of policy, so you know, there's many elements to it. I think that part of what's going on is that there's more and more of U.S. capital that is not happy with the terms that the Chinese government is placing on them for their businesses within China, in terms of technology sharing and the like, in terms of, you know, partnering with domestic Chinese companies. I think there's also a little bit of the shine of China has worn off in terms of a low wage hub, right? The wages have gone up in China, so the sort of low wage export sector doesn't view China quite as positively as they did maybe 15, 20 years ago. So there's elements of corporate of capital that's no longer is excited by China. There's, I think, some element of that in the U.S. At least, and maybe in Canada to some extent. Obviously, the bigger picture, the forces really pushing hard are the, you know, military-industrial complex security apparatus forces within Canada and within the U.S. Those are the ones that are really pushing this conflict with China. There's also a pretty intense racist element to it that I think is really kind of underplayed, and you see it when the Conservatives repeatedly say that we have to ally with our Five Eyes partners on China. Like, what are the Five Eyes? The Five Eyes are the US, Britain, Australia, New Zealand. Like, what connects those countries? Is it language? Well, there's more people in India that speak English than probably, you know, 100 times than New Zealand. There's more people in Nigeria that speak English. There's other, you know, wealthier countries that are not part of the Five Eyes. So what is it that connects the Five Eyes? Well, they are the European settler states, and, you know, Britain. They are the countries, the only 4 countries that didn't sign United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People happen to be part of the Five Eyes. So there's this like pretty open call to European empire settler solidarity in this campaign against China, and it's fascinating how little pushback there is on that from anti-racist forces within Canada or the U.S. or elsewhere. I think that's an important part of what's going on now. Radhika already touched on a number of the elements to it of what Canada's campaign regarding China, how that's manifested. Obviously, the effort to stop the rise of the crown jewel of China Inc., Huawei. That's this is what the arrest of Meng Wanzhou is about, in part banning of Huawei from creating 5G network in US already, and in Canada that's and the other Five Eyes country, and obviously from the Chinese elite's perspective, the idea that a top capitalist of their country can just be nabbed on very questionable grounds when traveling, using the Vancouver airport to go down to Mexico. Obviously, that's something that's very concerning to the Chinese elite. Now, the process of Huawei, we're moving on. The Americans have already banned a whole bunch of other Chinese leading technology companies. Now we're moving towards that process in Canada with the recent stuff around TikTok. The Canadian military has decided they're not going to have anything on TikTok because they're scared that this medium will lead to intelligence being passed on to the to the Chinese government. I haven't spent much time on TikTok, but from what I understand, if the Canadian military is concerned that something that's put on TikTok is going to help the Chinese military, that's a kind of a joke on the Canadian military. We have a situation where gold mines in the north of Canada are now strategic companies that we can't sell to Chinese companies, which is really ironic when you see that Canadian companies operate gold mines in dozens and dozens of countries around the world. Personally, I'd be a strong supporter of the idea of countries all around the world saying that gold mines are strategic assets that foreign companies can't own. But I think it would be the Canadian corporate world that would be the big that would be harmed by that process. So that they're moving at the economic level. There's these measures being taken, and then at the military level, we see that Canadian naval vessels for the past 4 years at least have consistently been running provocative maneuvers alongside American, French, British vessels in waters in the South China Sea that are disputed between China and different countries in the region, and there's been Canadian submarines that are going there in these quote unquote freedom of navigation operations. That is about sort of upping the military pressure. Canada has sought a military base in Singapore as part of keeping an eye on China. Back in 2012, the Canadian press reported, quote, "Canada is seeking a deal with Singapore to establish a military staging post there as part of its efforts to support the United States pivot towards Asia to counter a rising China." There are Canadian troops in Korea that are partly about containing China. The United Nations command in South Korea. There's of course about 30,000 US troops in South Korea. As well as the United Nations Command. The Canadians now in a second top position within that force. Canada had organized a conference back in early 2018 of the countries that fought in the Korean War in the early 1950s to increase their contribution to the United Nations Command in South Korea. The Financial Times explained about the UN force that it, quote, "serves to bolster and enhance the US's position in Northeast Asia at a time when China is rising." The sanctions, Canadian naval vessels, part of what they're in the region for is to monitor sanctions on North Korea. Canada's been pushing more and more sanctions on North Korea. Well, part of that, the line between overseeing UN sanctions on North Korea and sort of pressuring China is a pretty thin line. So Canada's been involved in that process. Now, the campaign against targeting China is this isn't new, right? Like it's ramped up at a huge level in the last year or so, or a couple years, but it's not new. I mean, if even you go back to, I think it's 2008, when Canada decided to start selling nuclear materials to India again after India used Canadian nuclear materials to produce a nuclear weapon. Already back then, the part of what was going on behind that was viewing India as part of its campaign, US-led campaign against China, and wanting to get better relations with India. If you go back earlier in this 1960s, you find that Canada's military training in Tanzania with Julius Nyerere was partly about countering Chinese influence in Tanzania. If you go back to the Korean War of 1950, 1953, where as many as 4 million people were killed, that was partly because the previous year, China had a nationalist communist forces, gained power and ended a century of humiliation and united China. And so the Korean War was part about trying to weaken China. If you go backwards in time and you look at, Canada's role in supporting the Kuomintang against Mao's forces, provided military support, financial support. Canada sent naval vessels after right around the time of the victory of Mao's forces. If you go backwards further, you find that Canada, there were Canadians who helped the British, certainly in Hong Kong during World War II, and then after World War II, in maintaining Hong Kong as a British colony, in terms of suppressing the Boxer Rebellion in the late 1800s. Canadian missionaries in China. So Canada contributed a small amount to the British imperial process in China, going backwards in time. Now, just to conclude, I think that I like I said, I find it a little bit I find it fascinating to see this division within the ruling class on China. The explicit corporate sectors are clearly losing. Right, they are clearly losing to the military-industrial complex, empire, racist, xenophobic kind of forces. I find that interesting, and I think that it's kind of because like again, there's a lot of major Canadian corporations that do business in China, that want to continue doing business in China. They see China as a huge market, a place to make all kinds of profits. And they are losing out at the ideological level. I'm doing a piece right now about the Globe and Mail reporters who are all up in arms about foreign influence in Canada. Right, there's this push to have a registry of foreign agents that are working for other governments, that are funded by other governments. The reporters that are pushing this, Robert Fife and Stephen Chase, they quote the Uyghur rights, a number of Uyghur rights organizations that explicitly state that they get funded by the National Endowment for Democracy, which is a U.S. does the work the CIA used to do, U.S. government department, for their work in Canada. Not just for their work, but for their work in Canada. So we're pushing on. We got to register foreign agents in Canada because the Chinese agents. But the reporters quoting these that part of this campaign are quoting and rely on groups that are explicitly funded by the American government to shape Canadian politics, and that's just silence. U.S. influence in Canada is complete silence. So I think that trying to make sense of some of this, I think go back to World War I, and I think there were lots of British capitalists that had economic relationships with German capitalists. There was a lot of British capitalists that had that knowledgeable about the history, but there were, ties between British and German capitalists, and that ultimately was pushed aside in the interests of the empire, and of course it led to World War I, and that was World War I is in large part due to competition between Germany and UK, France, and others in Africa, in Asia, and in dividing the world up. But I think that is some of the dynamic that we might be seeing today, where clearly the corporate interests that wanted even a couple years ago, wanted a free trade agreement with China, they are being pushed aside by the interests of the military-industrial complex, by the interests of US empire, and I'm hoping that this wave of xenophobia sweeping Canadian political life is just something that we will look back on in a decade or 2 decades and just think was kind of embarrassing and maybe funny. But I think that there's a real concern that something much, much worse will transpire. I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Yves. I'd now like to call on Tamara Lorincz to do her presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's really nice to be with you all. Thank you very much to the Peace Alliance Winnipeg for inviting me and sharing a panel with Radhika and with Yves. I'm speaking to you today from the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the neutral peoples of the Grand River here in Waterloo. And I'm so glad that we're having this important conversation about the new Cold War. In my 15 minutes, I would like to talk about this dangerous new initiative called NATO 2030 and military spending and how it's contributing to this new Cold War. And then I'd like to end with talking about what things the peace movement is doing in Canada to resist this, and how you might get involved and what more we can do. So I'm going to share my slides with you. I'm just going to hit share here. Can everyone see my slides okay? Great. So one of the main drivers of this new Cold War is NATO, as Radhika mentioned. And last June, the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg announced this new campaign called NATO 2030. And then 5 months later, NATO released an expert group's reflection report called NATO 2030 United for a New Era. And then in December, just a couple of months ago, NATO rolled out this big public relations campaign that you can see on social media, hashtag NATO 2030, making a strong alliance even stronger. This massive social media campaign, hashtag NATO 2030, builds on an earlier campaign that was started by NATO a couple of years ago called hashtag We Are NATO. So if you follow social media, NATO, the Canadian government, you'll see these tags a lot. And this is very much a propaganda campaign. So let's look a little bit at this report that just came out. I'm showing you here the table of contents. So this report and this initiative, NATO 2030, will be the main point of discussion at the next NATO summit that's expected to take place in Brussels in August. It's a 67-page report that has analysis and recommendations, and it identifies 13 threats and challenges. It's a dangerous expansion project for the alliance. Its main objective is to build the alliance's military strength and political solidarity, and to expand it geographically. You can see here the two major targets are Russia and China, and it very much inflates, the threat against these two countries. Consider the fact that right now, Canada is leading a NATO battle group in Latvia. We also have Canadian fighter jets in Romania that are, they're right along Russia's borders. We also have Canadian warships in the Mediterranean and in the Black Sea. All of this is part of a NATO operation called Operation Reassurance, but it's very much provocative to Russia. NATO 2030 also maintains NATO's dangerous nuclear deterrence, and it discusses new growth in artificial intelligence and cyber warfare. And it talks about something called, threats from the South. And this is very much NATO's racist concern about refugees fleeing Africa and the Middle East, and there's no acknowledgement in this report, in this initiative, about how NATO's wars in Syria, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and in Libya, how they've contributed to to people fleeing these countries. Just this past Wednesday, there were another 41 migrants who drowned in the Mediterranean, fleeing conflict-stricken Libya. As you'll remember, it was Canada as part of a NATO operation. Canada led the NATO operation of bombing Libya that totally destabilized the country. So this shipwreck this past Wednesday is just one of many over this past decade. I mean, just in this year alone, there's been 118 migrants who've died in the Mediterranean, fleeing North Africa. And over this past decade, there have been 17,000 people who've drowned in the Mediterranean, trying desperately to get to Europe. Canada is complicit in this. NATO is, very much fundamentally a violent, racist, white supremacist organization. In this NATO 2030 initiative, it also talks about something called an open door policy. So they're really trying to bring in the Ukraine, Georgia, and Bosnia into this alliance, and this is, extremely provocative to Russia. I want to show you this tweet that the Canadian mission at NATO released on February 17th, and they say, Canada supports the Secretary General's efforts to keep the alliance strong militarily, to make it stronger politically, and to make it global. And you can see the hashtags NATO 2030, and if you follow this Twitter account, Canada's Twitter account, you'll see We Are NATO all the time. And then 2 days later, this is the news from Biden's speech at the Munich Security Conference, very much a NATO conference, where he said that US support of the alliance is unshakable. And you might have also heard the news this week that there was a Twitter ban announced against some Twitter accounts that are undermining faith in NATO. So this is really extremely troubling. Now, another important point in this NATO 2030 initiative is pushing members to increase their military spending. You might remember that in 2014 at the NATO summit in Wales, all the NATO members agreed to increase their military spending to 2% of GDP. And about 3 or 4 times a year, the alliance members will give their military spending report to NATO, and this defense expenditure report is available on the NATO website, and you can see it. And this is what Canada submitted for 2020, and you can see, our military spending is $29 billion. And at this level of spending, it is 1.4% of GDP. If we increase military spending to meet that 2% GDP target, we're going to be looking at spending about $45 billion on our military every year. It's absolutely crazy. And the reason why NATO wants us to spend so much money, NATO is dominated and dictated by the United States. The United States wants its allies to buy its weapons. And 20% of our military spending is supposed to be for buying new equipment. This is why, Canada is spending, upwards of $77 billion to buy a new fleet of fighter jets, why we're building new warships at a cost of $77 billion, as the Parliamentary Budget Office just announced this week. So I want to show you this slide here. This shows, this is from NATO's defense expenditure report. It shows that Canada, is only about 1.4% of GDP. But if you were to look at a cash basis, at $29 billion of spending, Canada is ranked 6th highest among all NATO members, and Canada is ranked 14th highest in the world for military spending. So don't believe ever that Canada is not spending enough on its military spending. We're spending too much, and we absolutely need to reduce military spending and reallocate it to our urgent environmental and social needs. And I just want to show you this slide very quickly. There's a difference between how Canada reports military spending to NATO and how it reports military spending to public accounts. So you can see this graph that I prepared using the public accounts showing military spending over the past 20 years at about $30 billion compared to how much we spend on the Department of Environment and Climate Change, at $1.8 billion. I mean, it's so little. What we spend for global affairs, on diplomacy is only about $2.6 billion. So really our foreign policy and our posture to the world is a military posture. You might have also heard that last month, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons came into force. There were huge celebrations around the world. Canada is not joining this treaty to ban the worst weapons of mass destruction because of our membership in NATO. NATO has, a nuclear deterrence as its, central capability. So if we want Canada to get into the TPNW, this new treaty, we're going to have to get out of NATO. So now I would like to talk a little bit about why it's so critical for us to raise public opposition and political opposition and public opposition to NATO. Because if we don't stop this NATO 2030 initiative, we are going to be trapped forever into this Cold War militarism. NATO 2030 is going to prevent us from achieving the Paris Agreement targets by 2030. NATO 2030 is going to prevent us from achieving the UN Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. And I'm very concerned about the fact that many progressives and peace activists will not be honest about this, will not speak out against NATO. So I'm showing you the Canadian NATO Parliamentary Association. Most of our parliamentarians and senators are involved in this committee. So the NDP supports NATO. 30 years ago, the NDP had some courage to speak out on NATO, but it doesn't now. The Green Party is more ambivalent about NATO. Elizabeth May said, we should question our relationship in NATO, but they've never passed a resolution against NATO. The NDP Foreign Affairs critic Heather McPherson is a member of this parliamentary committee for NATO, and there are many, so-called progressive senators like Kim Pate and Mary Lou McFredrin that are also part of this Canadian NATO Parliamentary Association, and we have to get them out of this. We need to start working to dismantle the architecture of support for NATO. So I would also I would like to close by telling you how we're trying to resist this. So I'm very proud of the fact that a few years ago, the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace, I'm a member of this organization, we launched a campaign, Feminist Against Militarism. Women Say No to NATO. During NATO's 75th anniversary in 2019, we protested outside of the NATO Association of Canada's office in Toronto every single month, trying to raise public opposition to the alliance. The Canadian Voice of Women for Peace is part of this really great organization called No to War, No to NATO. I encourage you to check out the website and to get involved. No to NATO and the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace. We're having a fantastic talk by Ray Atchison. She wrote a chapter in a report put out by NATO Watch that criticizes this NATO 2030 initiative, and her chapter is entitled NATO and the Patriarchy, and she's going to be speaking about NATO and the patriarchy on a webinar on Sunday, March 7th for International Women's Day at 2 o'clock, and I encourage you to check it out. The Canadian peace movement has been really trying to rebuild over this past year. We have a new listserv, the Canada Peace Network. We have been working hard to try to stop the big CanSec arms show in Ottawa. We had a big demonstration in 2019. CanSec didn't happen this past year, but it's expected to happen virtually this year. So we're trying to create a resistance. We are also trying to stop the fighter jets. It's very much because of NATO that Canada is buying, new fighter jets, building warships, going to be buying new attack helicopters and armed drones, etc. This is why resistance to NATO is so critical. So I really encourage you to get involved and help us stop this purchase of the new fighter jets. We have about a year to do it because the federal government has said that they're going to, pick the new fighter jet sometime next year, and I'm happy to talk more about it during the Q&A. But I'll close by telling you about an event that we're going to be having in April to try to stop these new fighter jets, because we see this as a way to have a bigger conversation and to grow a bigger resistance against NATO and against militarism and military spending. We're going to be having this Fast for Peace, fast against the fighter jets. So we encourage you to join us. You don't necessarily have to do a fast, but you could do a meditation, or you could do candlelight ceremony, or a walk, or a demonstration, or something. But please help us stop the fighter jets, because it will also help us to get Canada out of NATO, to help abolish the alliance. I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tamara, and thank you to all the panelists for your very excellent presentations. I would now ask Paul, do we have, oh yes, we have some people who would like to speak. Paul, again, the protocol would be just to raise your hand, and then Paul can recognize you.
Right, and so I just need to change the view here so I can see what's going on. So in the bottom right-hand corner down there, there's something called reactions, and if you click on that, there's a little thing that says raise hand, and so that's how we'll know who wants to speak. And I don't see any hands raised just yet, but maybe I'm missing something.
Yeah, thank you so much, and greetings to everyone. Great presentations, I just love them. I get excited when I hear all this enthusiasm. I do have just a very short question. I have not heard in the presentations, unless I missed it, a reference to the Belt and Road Initiative from China. I think that in this framework of the new Cold War, I think we have a new arsenal, if you wish, that is being referred to as a hybrid war. And this is the hybrid war that's basically going on Russia and China. Now, specifically on China, I think that the Belt and Road Initiative has a tremendous, or might constitute a tremendous threat to the Five Eyes Alliance. This is an initiative that covers about 70 countries, if I understand correctly. And of course, it promotes social development and infrastructure in those countries, which interestingly is based more on cooperation rather than a capitalist and imperial interests. Now, I'm saying my appreciation. I would like to hear maybe from the speakers a response to that and how they see the BRI initiative from China.
Okay, who wants to take that first? Radhika?
Sure, I'd be very happy to. So first of all, I just want to say, I mean, it's very difficult to mention everything. So there'll probably be lots of other things that you will find that, but it's definitely part of the story. So really, the way I look at it, the Belt and Road Initiative really demonstrates the extent to which China is emerging both as a viable, but first of all, as a model for other countries to emulate about how to create more productive, more prosperous, and to a lesser extent, I would say more equal society, but we'll come back to that. And also as a partner in development, of a very, very different sort from the kind of partner the West has been, and particularly the United States. So in that sense, the Belt and Road Initiative is part of the extension of China's hand in the development of the rest of the world and constitutes an enormous challenge to the rest of the world. It is bringing a better, higher quality and more investment to third world countries than anything the West has offered or is capable of offering. So it's definitely a very, very important thing. Yeah.
Just to add a little bit.
And if I may just add one other thing. Basically, we have to take very seriously that this is the reason I emphasize the dangerousness and the volatility of the new Cold War as compared to the old Cold War is that the West is definitely on the losing side, so much so, particularly the United States, so much so that the Western alliance is also weakening. The extent to which the Japanese and the Europeans are willing to go along with this kind of, essentially a demonization of China is questionable. Mainly because China exerts such an enormous economic magnetism, even on these very prosperous parts of the world, let alone the less prosperous parts of the world. So on the one hand, they are capitalist countries at the end of the day, and they know that getting very close to China is going to be difficult. And on the other hand, they want to do business with China. So the internal dissension, both within the Canadian capitalist class and the American capitalist class, in terms of, parts of the capitalist class want to continue associating with China, and other parts benefit from essentially creating this what shall we say, this new Cold War. So consider somebody like Mark Zuckerberg. Facebook is banned from China. He has nothing to gain from getting close to China. So he, along with the military-industrial complex and other people who have essentially given up on China, they will be part of the anti-China lobby. And there will be others, including Bill Gates of this world and all sorts of other companies that still have investments in China, because China's wages may be rising, but China is also capable of supplying higher value goods where wages matter less. And increasingly importantly, China is now the magnet market. The days when the West was the market of the world are rapidly going. So China is now the new market. So both at the domestic level and at the international level, you will see incoherence in the strategy of all the different countries. And that incoherence adds to the danger of the war. That's what I'm trying to say. Sorry, Yves, I just thought of a point that I meant to say and then I had forgotten. So please go.
No, I just add that the Canadian government, I think it's in 2019, with the Export Development Canada, the US Overseas Private Investment Corporation, Australia, Japan's Bank for International Cooperation, they sort of put together an initiative that's designed to be a response to the Belt and Road Initiative. It's pretty kind of minimal. The amount of money that's put up is not that significant, but there's a sort of effort to kind of counter it. I think it is. There's a kind of important point. Like, clearly today with regards to Venezuela, China offers some form of challenge to U.S. Canadian domination effort to overthrow the government, and ipso facto it becomes a clearly progressive force within Venezuela. I think the geopolitics of that vary depending on each country, but I think broadly, if you look at the global South, if you look at countries in Africa that have been dominated by Britain, France, the US, broadly, the Belt and Road Initiative becomes progressive, becomes something at minimum. You got to get into all the details of each specific project, but at minimum, it offers an alternative to the power of the U.S., Britain, and France. I think generally it's a more the more progressive alternative. That if you get into the specifics of each project and each loan or railway line or whatever, but just at a macro level, having an alternative to U.S.-led, British, French, whatever power becomes progressive from the perspective of the Ethiopian government or the Kenyan government or etc.
And I'd add to that just a small point that the biggest reason why China's extension of help in development is more beneficial to third world countries than that of the West is that China does not require these countries, does not dictate policy to these countries. It does not dictate neoliberal policies to these countries. This is the key point. But yeah, I agree with most all the other things that you said.
Okay. Tamara, did you want to join in on this one? If yes, here's your chance. And if not, Tyrone has a question.
Well, I just want to show a stark difference here. So, the China's Belt and Road Initiative is, as Radhika explained, very much a development project, helping countries, with needed infrastructure like, light rail, ports, etc. You think about what NATO is doing and what NATO is requiring. So the Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, have NATO battle groups right now. And in order for those countries to host NATO battle groups, they had to spend millions and millions and millions of dollars for military infrastructure. So Latvia, for instance, just spent millions of dollars building housing for Canadian soldiers. We have 450 soldiers right now in Latvia, right on NATO's border. That's what NATO is causing. That's what Canada and NATO are causing, to Latvia is for that country to spend their precious tax dollars on military infrastructure instead investing in their people, on healthcare, education, etc. So, friends, this is why it's so critical for us to unite and to oppose NATO.
Okay, Tyrone, do you want to pose your question, please?
Sure. So I'm just looking for the panelists' thoughts on how the emergence of the pandemic may influence or affect capitalist or neoliberal doctrines, or the political and new Cold War landscape, including the socioeconomic landscape. Second part of the question is, another part of the question is, will these new conditions lead to greater degrees of socialist-leaning policy, governance, and military prowess?
I'd certainly like to come back on that because, Tyrone, I've precisely written a great deal on this particular question in the pages of Canadian Dimension, so if you're interested. And so very briefly, I would say that the pandemic has accelerated a crisis of neoliberal capitalism that was already ongoing. It has massively accelerated. This crisis has both domestic as well as international dimensions, because domestically, the ability of capitalism to cope with the crisis, especially the most neoliberal forms of capitalism to cope with the crisis, have been manifestly lower, far lower than that of China, and that the contrast between the two responses is huge, and it cannot, unlike those sort of anti-China rhetoric, it cannot be put down to China's authoritarian system. authoritarianism would not do this. In fact, we are seeing here much more mere authoritarianism in the sense that, you know, people are blaming poor people who have to go to work, for instance, for spreading the virus, when in fact we should be supporting people in order to isolate themselves if they are infected, and we are not doing that. China has done that sort of thing. So all in all, China's response has been better, and as a consequence, its ability to recover from the effect of the lockdown effect, the economic effect of the lockdown has been huge. So the World Bank estimates that China is going to be the most, it's essentially, it is going to lead world growth. That of all the growth that is going to take place in 2021 and 2022, China will account for the bulk of it. And that is because of that. So I think that cannot but have a demonstration effect for those who are kind of taking notes about how to run an economy in the interest of ordinary people rather than in the interest of an ever narrowing sliver of capitalists and big corporations. And meanwhile, if you take the United States as an example of a neoliberal government, what we are looking at is precisely what happens when you have a neoliberal government in charge, when you are hit by a pandemic. What was the first response of US public authorities? It was to inject billions of dollars, trillions of dollars into the stock markets and financial markets in order to preserve the value of the investment of the tiniest sliver of the people. For the rest, all the fiscal, for all the debates and so on, what is the fiscal stimulus they have managed to pass? It's hardly anything compared to what is needed. And what's more, will they really have the capacity to do this if they are not able to tax their corporations? We are looking at 40 years of reducing corporations' taxes and so on. So these are just some elements of an example of totally contrasting pandemic responses. China on one extreme and the neoliberal countries on the other extreme. Everybody else is somewhere in between, but you can, yeah. And one other thing, especially in the UK, it is very clear that a huge part of the government's response to the pandemic has been nothing more or less than simply using the pandemic as an opportunity to hand over lucrative, risk-free contracts to the friends of the members of the government, to big corporate capital. This is what has happened in the context of the pandemic in the UK.
Okay, Yves or Tamara, do either of you wish to comment on this question?
I'll pass.
And Tamara?
Well, I just want to thank Tyrone for the question. It makes me think that this pandemic moment that we're in it is such an important moment for us to, question militarized security. I think how NATO members over the past 3 years, we're spending so much on the military, more $100 billion additional dollars over the past 3 years before the pandemic was spent on NATO members' militaries. And just before the pandemic started, NATO was working on its biggest war exercise ever called Defender 2020. So, NATO makes us unable to deal with the real human security challenges that we're facing, which is this global, pandemic, the poverty crisis, the climate crisis. So, it's diverting our attention, it's diverting our resources away from what really provides security to people. And we need to use this moment to really, challenge those long-held misconceptions about militarized security.
I do not see any more hands raised. And so I wonder, given that we have about 12 minutes left in our allocated time for this webinar, if we could ask the presenters if they have some concluding remarks that they'd like to make.
That's good, Paul. And just before we go to that, I would just like to, and I'm posting it in the chat now, it should be there, is the online panel discussion on Monday that's coming up, the arrest of Meng Wanzhou and the new Cold War on China. You should see the link there. So another important webinar to take in.
And I just wanted to say a couple of things. First of all, I particularly wanted to thank you reminding us of the historical role Canada has played in the wider imperialist system, and particularly vis-a-vis China. And Yves has a great article in Canadian Dimension, to which I direct your attention because it really sums up very beautifully the the role that Canada has played over a very long historical period in reinforcing first British imperialism, and of course now is reinforcing at least American attempts at imposing its domination on the rest of the world. And we forget in Canada when we keep congratulating ourselves for what a nice country we are and how we promote peace and democracy and all these things, that in fact Canada has always been a very critical part of the imperialist system. It has benefited from the imperialist system. So for instance, in the period up to 1914, Canada was the beneficiary of a set of arrangements in which Britain extracted surpluses from her non-settler colonies, like South Asia, like India, like Africa, like the Caribbean. Those surpluses went to Britain, and then they took the form of capital exports to her settler colonies, precisely the Five Eyes that we are talking about. The United States, which had become an ex-settler colony, and the existing settler colony. So that it has always had a very favored niche in the structures of imperialism, and we have to understand Canada in that form. And today, increasingly, we also see the possibility that if and when the American role shrinks, Canada is asserting itself in its own independent power in the third world. So we have to see Canada as an imperialist country. And secondly, I also thank him in reminding us that historically, the way in which the West has confronted China has been always to try through proxies. And India has in recent decades emerged as a major proxy. And today, India is ruled by a government of the BJP-led government, which is, to me, the BJP is a fascist party. It's ruled by a government that has a long history of offering itself to the United States as a counterweight to China. And India is today part of the so-called Quad that the United States is organizing in the so-called Indo-Pacific. That is to say, it will be an alliance between the United States on the one hand, and then Japan, Australia, and India. And the very purpose of this alliance is to threaten China militarily. So I just wanted to add that. And for the rest, yes, I particularly wanted to thank Carol for her question or her point. We've discussed all these things. So what is the next step? Are we going to build a peace movement, an anti-war movement? And I think this is definitely an item on our agenda, because I think the moment is ripe. The capitalist system is in many ways losing many options, although it is going to react to this loss of options in an aggressive fashion, but it is also creates an opening for us to act in some ways, do what Tamara is suggesting, and generally speaking, spearhead a movement against NATO, against nuclear weapons, against war, against massive reductions in military spending, and for respecting the national sovereignty of other countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Radhika. Yves.
Well, yeah, I just wanted to respond a little bit to one of Rosemary's questions in the chat around the divisions within the capitalist class in Canada. In 2007, 2008, when Harper sort of got into a kind of anti-China type of policy, the framing, of course, was we weren't going to sell out our values, right? So he was choosing values over corporate profits, but in fact, he was choosing empire and white supremacy over corporate profits. Harper kind of got pushed towards a more moderate policy on China, and I think it partly is because the U.S. wasn't as gripped by anti-China kind of sentiment at the time, and one of the forces that pushed back against Harper really clearly was La Presse newspaper, which was at that time was the biggest, owned by the Desmarais family, which was very close to Jean Chrétien, owners of Power Corporation, And the Desmarais family has, since the late 70s, big investors in China, began really the Canada-China Business Council. So, you know, there's companies like Power Corporation, Bank of Montreal, Manulife. The other companies, you know, Bell and TELUS weren't on board. They've been kind of been forced into it, but they weren't on board with the banning of Huawei in the 5G. They were doing business with Huawei because that was the cheapest, best 5G network provider. So there are real divisions within corporate Canada. My reading is that in the past 6 months, a year, those corporate sectors who are either doing business with China or want to do more business with China have left the ideological plane to the anti-China kind of voices, and it's getting towards a near unanimity within the dominant media on the issue. But there is divisions, and I think that what Radhika was saying was, I think you know, that is a really important point of the ultimately the Canadian ruling class understands that it has had a privileged place with the two main empires of the past couple centuries, British Empire, the US Empire. Canadian corporate elite have had a uniquely privileged place with those two empires. And so ultimately they've done very well by that arrangement. And so if push comes to shove, which to some extent that's what's happening with China today, they're going to ally with the U.S. empire, even if if on the surface of it might lead to an undermining of some profit opportunities with regards to China today. And just on a final note, on a totally different subject, I really invite people to take a look at the film Haiti Betrayed. The Canadian Foreign Policy Institute is doing a discussion of that film tomorrow night at 7:30. You can find more information. I put it in the chat. You can find it at foreignpolicy.ca. The film is available for the next 2 days for free. It's probably the best film on Canadian foreign policy. By watching that film, people will very much doubt the whole idea of Canada as a benevolent force internationally, which helps to ground some of this discussion of you know, calling the what's going on in Xinjiang as a genocide, and all this sort of the, you know, hyper moralism of Canadian foreign policy decision maker.
Tamara?
I would like to close with saying thank you very much to the Peace Alliance Winnipeg for hosting this webinar, and for everybody who's been tuning in. I put my email in the chat. I would really like to connect with you all. Though we have very few resources in the peace and anti-war movement in Canada, it's vital that we stick together, that we unite. That's where our strength is, and really we can make a big difference. I also want to encourage you to to follow World Beyond War. It has a new Canadian coordinator named Rachel Small. If you're on that email list, you'll get announcements about tons of different events that are taking place, and you'll find out more about how we're trying to stop Canada's arms sales to Saudi Arabia, and how we're trying to stop the fighter jets, and the drones that Canada's going to buy from Israel, etc. So it's a good way to connect. You can join our email list, the Canada Peace Network, and also Yves mentioned the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute. I would encourage you to be involved in that as well, to get on the email list, because there's great events and speakers through that. And it was the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute people who last spring worked together really hard to keep Canada off the UN Security Council, and we were victorious. So even though we might seem small, we can be really mighty when we work together. And so, we have lots of work to do this year to stop the fighter jets in particular. It's the second largest procurement in Canadian history. It's upwards of $77 billion. We absolutely have to stop it. And then I also just want to remind you to come to our webinar for Sunday, March 7th at 2 o'clock to celebrate International Women's Day, where we'll be talking about NATO and the patriarchy. Friends, let's have courage to say no to NATO. Let's have courage to say we need Canada to really show leadership for peace and for disarmament. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. My impressions of today was despite the very difficult situation we seem to face, there's very positive developments. All three of our speakers themselves very active, and it shows that there is really a developing movement in this country. Though it may be small, it can be effective, as they've all said. So to me, I think this is a very positive message today. Very good discussion. Tomorrow's event, Monday's event, I did post a few minutes ago in the chat about the new Cold War and Meng Wanzhou. I noticed in the material for that it also offers a translation during the event into Mandarin and French. So it's in the chat, and you can search it out easily enough on the web. And all the events that people have mentioned, very worthy taking in. So I thank you very much for making this event very positive and very successful. And with that, I can say we'll close the meeting. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you. Bye. In solidarity.
Yes, in solidarity. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
And we'll see you again soon on another topic.